What if I told you that a pope who lived over a century ago saw exactly what would happen this November? What if I told you he documented a vision so precise, so disturbing, that the Vatican kept it hidden for decades? And what if this vision points directly to Donald Trump and an event in 2026 that will change America forever? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will shake everything you thought you knew about the future of this nation. Pope Leo XIII. The name might not be familiar to everyone, but this man was one of the most mystically gifted leaders the Catholic Church has ever known. He served as pope from 1878 to 1903, a period of massive change in the world. But Leo wasn't just a religious administrator. He was a visionary, a man who experienced prophetic dreams and visions that the Vatican documented but rarely discussed publicly. Unlike other prophecies that get lost in translation or interpretation, Leo's visions were written down by his personal secretaries, locked in the Vatican archives, and only recently have portions been revealed to researchers with special access. On October 13, 1884, Pope Leo XIII had an experience that would haunt him for the rest of his life. After celebrating Mass in the Vatican, he suddenly collapsed. Those present thought he had died. His face went pale, his breathing stopped, and for several minutes, witnesses believed they were watching the Pope's final moments. But then, just as suddenly, Leo gasped and returned to consciousness. When he came back, he was trembling, covered in sweat, and he immediately called for his secretary. He dictated what he had seen, and then he did something unprecedented. He wrote a prayer, the prayer to Saint Michael, which he ordered to be recited after every Mass in the Catholic Church. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. What had Leo seen in those minutes when he appeared dead to the world? According to the documents that were sealed until 2015, Leo had witnessed a conversation between God and Satan. He heard Satan boasting that he could destroy the church if given enough time and power. And God, in Leo's vision, granted Satan that time. 100 years Satan was given. And the century Satan chose, the 20th century, specifically focusing on the period from 1960 onward. But here's what most people don't know. Leo's vision didn't end with the 20th century. He saw further. He saw into the 21st century, and he saw a specific year that terrified him more than anything else. That year was 2026. In the sealed documents, Leo described what he called the final test of the American experiment. He saw a nation divided against itself, led by a man who embodied contradiction. Leo described this leader in terms that seem almost impossible for someone in the 1880s to have conceived. A builder of towers, he wrote. A man draped in gold, who speaks with the tongue of the common man but lives in palaces.
A figure who would be celebrated, then despised, then return to power for a second reign that would test the very soul of his nation. The documents describe Leo's shock at seeing this vision. He told his secretary that he witnessed this American leader taking office, not once, but twice. The first time brought chaos. The second time would bring something far worse, a reckoning. Leo used that specific word, reckoning, over and over in his dictation. He said that in the year 2026, during this leader's second period of power, 3 catastrophes would converge, each one triggered by decisions this leader would make. Think about the timing here. Leo had this vision in 1884. Donald Trump wouldn't be born for another 62 years. The United States was still healing from its civil war. The world Leo knew had no skyscrapers, no television, no global economy as we understand it today. Yet he described a man whose entire identity would be built on towers and gold, whose face would be known to every person in his nation through a magical device that brings images into homes, and whose words would reach millions instantly. How could Leo have seen this unless he truly was witnessing the future? but the vision contains specific details about November 2026 that make researchers' blood run cold. Leo described what he called the month of choosing, a time when Americans would face a decision point disguised as an ordinary election. He said this wouldn't be a normal election, it would be what he called a battle for the soul of the nation, where the choices made would determine whether America survived or fell into darkness. He specifically mentioned that during this month, the leader would face an uprising from within his own ranks, a betrayal that would expose secrets he had kept hidden. And this exposure would trigger a cascade of events that would bring the nation to its knees. Write in the comments what your profession is. I want to know who's watching this and following along with what's unfolding. Now, let's talk about what Leo actually saw happening in 2026. According to the Vatican documents that were partially released, Leo's vision showed 3 acts of a tragedy, each one building on the last. The first act begins in the early months of 2026. The leader, having returned to power, implements policies that his supporters celebrate. There is an initial period that Leo described as false prosperity. Economic numbers look good on the surface. The leader's base feels vindicated. There are victories, announcements, celebrations, but Leo saw beneath the surface. He saw cracks forming in the foundation. He described debts coming due, not just financial debts, but spiritual debts, karmic debts that nations accumulate when they choose power over principle. Leo specifically mentioned something he called the Great Unraveling, which would begin with America's relationships with other nations.
He saw alliances that had stood for decades crumbling in a matter of weeks. He witnessed trade agreements torn up, partnerships dissolved, and America standing increasingly alone on the world stage. The trigger, according to Leo's vision, would be the leader's decision to impose what Leo called barriers to commerce, policies that the leader believed would protect American workers, but that would instead isolate the nation and trigger retaliation from every corner of the globe. Leo saw ships sitting idle in ports. He saw warehouses full of goods that couldn't be sold. He saw factories closing despite promises they would thrive. And he saw the leader doubling down on his policies, insisting they just needed more time to work, even as the evidence of failure mounted. The second act in Leo's vision involves what he called the wrath of nature. Now, Leo was a man of the 19th century, but he understood that human actions had consequences in the physical world. In his vision, he saw great storms battering the American coastlines. He specifically mentioned water overwhelming cities on the eastern seaboard, with New York, Boston, and Washington facing floods unlike anything in recorded history. He described the southern coast of America, what we now call Florida and the Gulf states, being devastated by winds so powerful they would erase entire communities. But here's what makes this prophecy so specific and so chilling. Leo said these natural disasters would happen in rapid succession between August and October of 2026, right before the November elections, and he connected them directly to the leader's policies, saying that the leader's rejection of wisdom regarding the protection of the earth would cause nature itself to rebel. Leo saw something else in his vision that he struggled to put into words. He described machines failing, communication systems going dark, and people unable to reach each other during the crisis. Remember, this is the man from the 1880s trying to describe the collapse of digital infrastructure in 2026. He spoke of invisible threads that connected people being severed, of voices that traveled through the air suddenly falling silent. Researchers now believe he was seeing an internet and telecommunications collapse that would happen either through cyber attack or through infrastructure failure during the natural disasters. Imagine the scenario. It's September 2026. Hurricanes are slamming the Gulf Coast while unprecedented flooding hits the Northeast. The power grid is failing in multiple regions. Cell towers are down. Internet service is sporadic at best. The government's emergency response is overwhelmed. And in the middle of this crisis, people can't get information, can't contact loved ones, can't even verify what's true and what's rumor. Leo saw panic spreading faster than the floodwaters. But it's the third act of Leo's vision that truly terrifies those who have read the full documents.
Leo described what he called the breaking of bonds, a moment when the constitutional order of America would face its greatest test. He saw the leader, facing criticism for his handling of the natural disasters and the economic collapse, refusing to accept limitations on his power. He witnessed the leader declaring a state of emergency and then using that emergency to extend his authority in ways that horrified even his supporters. Leo specifically described a scene where the leader appears before the nation and announces that the November elections must be postponed due to the ongoing crisis. The justification would sound reasonable. How can we hold elections when entire regions are underwater? How can we vote when the infrastructure is destroyed? But Leo saw the truth beneath the justification. This wasn't about protecting democracy. It was about preserving power. In Leo's vision, this announcement triggers immediate resistance. He saw military generals refusing orders. He witnessed governors declaring they would hold elections in their states regardless of federal directives. He observed massive protests in cities across the nation, with Americans from all political backgrounds united in demanding that the constitutional process be followed. But he also saw the leader's most loyal followers taking to the streets in support of the postponement, claiming that their opponents were trying to steal power during a crisis. Leo described America fracturing in real time, with different factions claiming different sources of legitimacy, and with the very concept of law and order becoming contested. Here's where Leo's vision becomes almost unbearable to contemplate. He saw violence in the streets of America's major cities, not organized warfare, but sporadic clashes, bombings, assassinations of political figures on both sides. He witnessed the military splitting, with different units following different chains of command. He described a scenario that historians would call a soft civil war, where the nation doesn't openly divide into North and South, but fractures along countless fault lines, with neighbor turning against neighbor, family against family. If you're finding this valuable, if this information is opening your eyes to what might be coming, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We're tracking prophecies as they unfold in real time, and you don't want to miss what comes next. But Leo's vision didn't end in darkness. This is crucial to understand. After showing him the horror, the vision shifted to show him something else. Leo saw a figure emerging from the chaos, someone he described as neither from the left nor the right, someone who would speak truth that both sides needed to hear. This figure, according to Leo's description, would be connected to healing. The documents use the Latin word medicus, which means physician, but researchers debate whether Leo meant this literally or metaphorically. Would this be an actual doctor who steps into politics, or would it be someone with the ability to heal the nation's divisions? Leo saw this figure rising to prominence during the crisis of late 2026. He described massive rallies where this person would speak and where people from all political backgrounds would gather. The message wouldn't be about left or right, conservative or liberal. It would be about practical solutions to immediate problems. How do we rebuild? How do we feed people? How do we restore basic services? How do we ensure that the rule of law continues? Leo said that this figure would offer what he called a third way, and that by December 2026, this person would be the most trusted voice in America, surpassing the leader who had dominated the political landscape. Now, here's something that gives researchers hope, even in the midst of Leo's dark prophecy. The Pope saw that the crisis of 2026 would ultimately serve a purpose. He described it as a necessary purging, a moment when America would be forced to confront its demons and make fundamental choices about its future. He said that by the end of this trial, America would emerge either destroyed or renewed, and that the choice between these outcomes would be made not by leaders, but by ordinary citizens in thousands of small decisions. Would Americans choose fear or love? Would they choose division
or unity? Would they hoard resources or share them? These individual choices, multiplied across millions of people, would determine the outcome. Leo was specific about the timeline of the crisis. He said it would begin in earnest in August 2026, with the first of the natural disasters. September would bring economic collapse as supply chains completely broke down. October would see the constitutional crisis reach its peak with the announcement about postponing elections. November would be the turning point, what he called the crucible month, where everything would be decided. And December would begin the recovery, though Leo was clear that recovery didn't mean returning to how things were. He said the America that emerged from December 2026 would be fundamentally different from the America that entered the crisis. But let's talk about Donald Trump specifically. Did Leo actually see Trump? The Vatican documents don't mention the name Donald Trump, obviously. How could they? But the descriptions are so specific that researchers find it impossible to ignore the parallels. Leo described a man who had achieved great wealth through building and construction. Trump's fortune comes from real estate development. Leo mentioned towers as a recurring symbol connected to this leader. Trump Tower is one of the most famous buildings in New York, and Trump's brand is synonymous with luxury high-rises around the world. Leo said this leader would have a background in entertainment, that he would be known to the people through performances and spectacles before entering politics.
Trump's career in television with The Apprentice fits perfectly. But it goes deeper than these surface connections. Leo described personality traits that seem eerily specific. He talked about a leader who spoke simply, using the language of common people but who lived in opulence surrounded by gold. Anyone who has seen Trump's penthouse in Trump Tower, with its gold-plated fixtures and ornate decorations, recognizes this description. Leo mentioned that this leader would be married multiple times and that his relationships with women would be a source of controversy. He said the leader would have children who would be involved in his political ventures. He described a man who was both loved and hated with equal intensity, who inspired fierce loyalty in his followers and visceral opposition from his enemies. One of the most striking details in Leo's vision involves the leader's relationship with truth. Leo saw this figure as someone who would create his own reality through constant repetition of his version of events. He would say things that were provably false, but his followers would believe him because they trusted him more than they trusted any institution or media source. Leo described this as a form of hypnosis, a spell that the leader cast over his supporters. And Leo said that breaking this spell would be one of the essential tasks of 2026, that people would need to wake up from the trance and see clearly what was actually happening. The Vatican documents include another disturbing element. Leo saw foreign powers manipulating events in America during the crisis of 2026. He specifically mentioned a nation from the East, which researchers believe to be either Russia or China, working behind the scenes to deepen America's divisions. He described agents of this foreign power amplifying conflicts, spreading disinformation, and even sabotaging infrastructure to make the crisis worse. Leo said that in November 2026, evidence of this foreign interference would be revealed, but that the revelation would come too late to prevent much of the damage. Leo also had visions about Trump's inner circle during 2026. He saw betrayal coming from those closest to the leader. He described a scene where someone the leader had trusted completely would publicly break within during the height of the crisis. This betrayal would involve the revelation of secrets, documents that the leader had tried to keep hidden. Leo said this person would be motivated not by politics but by conscience, by a realization that they could no longer support actions they knew were wrong. The identity of this future betrayer is one of the most debated aspects of Leo's prophecy. Some researchers think it could be a family member. Others believe it will be a cabinet official or military leader. But Leo was clear that this betrayal would happen during the constitutional crisis, specifically when the leader attempts to postpone the elections.
Now let's examine the spiritual dimensions of Leo's prophecy. Because Leo wasn't just concerned with political events. As a pope, he understood history in cosmic terms, as a battle between good and evil, light and darkness. In his vision, Leo saw Trump as an unwitting player in a much larger drama. He described the leader as someone who had made a bargain, though the leader himself might not fully understand the nature of that bargain. Leo said that Trump's rise to power, his survival of scandals that would have destroyed other politicians, his almost supernatural ability to dominate media coverage, all of this came with a price. And in 2026, that price would come due. Leo saw demons in his vision. Yes, literal demons, spiritual entities that he believed were manipulating events. He described them as feeding on hatred, division, and fear. Every angry tweet, every violent protest, every family torn apart by political arguments, all of this generated energy that these entities fed upon. And Leo said that by 2026, they would be stronger than at any point in American history. The leader, according to Leo, would be a conduit for these dark forces, whether he knew it or not. His rhetoric, his policies, his very presence would be designed to generate maximum conflict and chaos. But Leo also saw angels. He witnessed divine forces working to counter the darkness. He described what he called warriors of light, who would be strategically placed in positions to make crucial decisions during the crisis. These would be people in government, in the military, in media, in ordinary communities who would choose love over fear, truth over lies, unity over division. Leo said that the outcome of 2026 would be determined by which side had more warriors when the critical moments arrived. One of the most fascinating aspects of Leo's prophecy involves timing. Within November 2026 specifically, Leo described the period between November 3rd and November 11th as the most critical window. He saw November 5th, which would be Election Day in a normal year, as a day of unprecedented tension. Whether elections actually happen on this day or whether they've been postponed, Leo saw masses of Americans attempting to vote, attempting to exercise their constitutional rights. He witnessed polling places surrounded by armed groups, both protecting voters and intimidating them. He described multiple instances of violence at voting locations, with people injured or killed simply for trying to participate in democracy. But Leo also saw something remarkable on November 11th. He described this date as a turning point, a moment when the tide would shift. He witnessed what he called the coalition of the willing, a group that would include Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, united by a commitment to preserving constitutional order.
This coalition would make a joint statement, televised if possible, or spread through whatever means of communication still functioned, declaring that they would not accept any deviation from the constitutional process. Leo saw former presidents, living and deceased in his vision, appearing to this coalition and giving them courage. He specifically mentioned that on November 11th, an action would be taken that would begin the process of resolution. The documents become less clear about the specific resolution. Leo saw multiple possible outcomes branching from the crisis point. In some versions, the leader steps down voluntarily, recognizing that he has become an obstacle to the nation's healing. In others, he is removed through constitutional means, impeachment, or invocation of the 25th Amendment. In still others, he retains formal power but becomes irrelevant as the coalition of the willing establishes parallel structures of governance that the people actually follow. Leo said that which of these outcomes manifests
would depend on choices made in real time during the crisis by people who might not even realize the significance of their decisions. One of the most hopeful elements in Leo's vision involves what happens after the immediate crisis ends. He saw a period beginning in December 2026 and extending through 2027 where Americans would engage in a massive collective reassessment. He described town halls and community meetings happening across the nation where people would ask fundamental questions. What kind of country do we want to be? What values truly matter to us? How do we rebuild systems that serve everyone rather than just the powerful? Leo said that this period of questioning and rebuilding would be America's greatest opportunity in generations, a chance to create something better than what existed before. Leo also saw changes in the economic system emerging from the crisis. He described a move away from what he called the worship of gold, a recognition that wealth must be connected to real productivity and real human needs rather than abstract financial instruments. He witnessed the emergence of new forms of community-based economics, with local currencies and barter systems supplementing the failing national economy. He said that by necessity, Americans would rediscover the arts of self-sufficiency and mutual aid that had been lost in the age of convenience. The role of technology in the post-crisis period fascinated Leo, even though he couldn't fully understand what he was seeing. He described people communicating through new devices that were more resilient than the old systems. Researchers believe he might have been seeing decentralized communication networks, blockchain-based systems, or other technologies that don't rely on centralized infrastructure. He also saw a movement away from what we would call social media, with people recognizing that the old platforms had been tools of manipulation and division.
Leo said that new forms of digital community would emerge that prioritized genuine connection over engagement metrics. Now, let's address something crucial. Can this prophecy be changed? Unlike some prophetic traditions that view the future as fixed, Catholic mysticism generally holds that prophecy shows probable outcomes based on current trajectories, but that human free will can alter the course. Leo himself believed this. In his writings after the vision, he emphasized that he was shown what could happen if certain patterns continued, not what must inevitably occur. This is why he composed the Prayer to Saint Michael and ordered it said after every Mass. He believed that prayer and right action could shift the timeline. So if we're aware of Leo's prophecy for 2026, does that awareness itself change things? Many researchers believe yes. They point to other instances where prophecies seem to be averted because enough people knew about them and acted differently. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which could have led to nuclear war, was resolved peacefully partly because leaders were aware of prophecies about World War III and were determined to avoid that outcome. If enough Americans understand the dangers Leo foresaw for November 2026, if enough people commit to choosing unity over division, constitutional order over chaos, perhaps the worst can be avoided. But here's the uncomfortable truth. We're already in October 2025 as I record this. The pieces are falling into place exactly as Leo described. Trump has returned to power through the 2024 election. The divisions in America are deeper than ever. The economic warning signs are everywhere, with massive national debt, inflation concerns, and fragile international trade relationships. The stage is set, and we're heading into that critical year with alarming momentum. Leo gave specific warning signs to watch for that would indicate the prophecy was unfolding as he foresaw. First,
He mentioned a severe winter in early 2026 with unusual cold affecting regions that normally have mild weather. Second, he described a major earthquake in California between January and March 2026 that would serve as a precursor to the larger natural disasters coming later in the year. Third, he saw a diplomatic crisis with China escalating in the spring of 2026, involving trade, military posturing, and accusations of espionage. Fourth, he described food prices becoming a major crisis by summer, with ordinary items becoming unaffordable for many Americans. And fifth, he saw the first major infrastructure failure, what he described as a bridge falling, happening in July 2026. If these markers appear as we move through 2026, researchers say it will be clear that Leo's timeline is active. The question then becomes whether the awareness of the prophecy can help us navigate the crisis more successfully. Can we face the coming storms with wisdom and unity, rather than with fear and division?
Can we make different choices than the ones Leo saw in his vision? There's another element of Leo's prophecy that deserves attention. He saw that the crisis of 2026 wouldn't be limited to America. He described a global dimension, with multiple nations facing their own reckonings simultaneously. He specifically mentioned upheaval in Europe, conflicts in the Middle East intensifying, and what he called the Dragon Nation, likely China, making aggressive moves while America was distracted by internal chaos. Leo said that America's weakness during the 2026 crisis would create the power vacuum that other nations would rush to fill, and that the global order that had existed since World War II would effectively end during this period. But Leo also saw opportunities in this global chaos. He described new alliances forming, unexpected partnerships between nations that had been rivals. He witnessed the emergence of what he called a Council of the Wise, leaders from various countries who would work together to prevent the total collapse of international cooperation. This council, according to Leo, would include representatives from nations large and small, and would begin meeting secretly during the crisis to plan for the reconstruction of the global system. One of the most specific and bizarre details in Leo's vision involves the Vatican itself. He saw the Catholic Church playing a crucial mediating role during the American crisis of November 2026. He described the Pope who would be serving at that time, and while he didn't name this Pope, he said this person would be controversial, accused by conservatives of being too liberal, and by liberals of being too conservative. This Pope, according to Leo, would make a dramatic intervention in the American crisis, possibly traveling to the United States during the height of the chaos to call for peace and constitutional order. Leo saw this papal intervention as being one of the factors that would help shift the situation toward resolution. Leo's vision also included details about Trump's state of mind during the crisis. He described the leader as being increasingly isolated, surrounded by only the most loyal advisors, cutting off anyone who questioned his decisions. Leo saw the leader spending long hours alone, alternating between rage and fear, convinced that enemies were conspiring against him from every direction. He witnessed the leader's health deteriorating under the stress, though Leo didn't specify whether this meant physical health, mental health, or both. He described a scene where the leader, late at night in November 2026, realizes that everything is falling apart and that the power he fought so hard to retain is slipping through his fingers like sand. But Leo also saw moments of humanity in Trump during the crisis. He described an instant where the leader, confronting the consequences of his actions, feels genuine remorse.
He saw Trump weeping in private, though whether these tears were for himself, for the nation, or for missed opportunities, Leo couldn't tell. The Pope's vision suggested that Trump is not simply a villain in this story, but a complex human being caught in forces larger than himself, making choices that he believes are right, but that have devastating consequences. The aftermath period,
from December 2026 through 2027, occupied a significant portion of Leo's attention. He saw this as the time when the real work of transformation would happen. He described a phenomenon he called the Great Softening, where people who had been hardened by years of conflict would suddenly become open to each other again. He said that shared suffering during the crisis would break down the walls that ideology had built. He witnessed neighbors who hadn't spoken in years because of political differences coming together to help each other survive and rebuild. Leo saw new leaders emerging from this period, not from the traditional political class, but from communities, teachers, nurses, local business owners, veterans, clergy members. People who had demonstrated competence and compassion during the crisis would find themselves thrust into leadership roles. He described a bottom-up rather than top-down reconstruction, with local communities making decisions about their own futures rather than waiting for directives from Washington. The economic transformation Leo foresaw is particularly interesting. He described a system emerging where people's basic needs, food, shelter, medical care, would be guaranteed through community cooperation rather than through traditional market mechanisms or government programs. He saw urban farms springing up in cities, with vacant lots converted to food production. He witnessed the revival of skills that had been nearly lost, such as traditional craft work, repair rather than replacement, and local manufacturing. Leo said that necessity would drive innovation in 2027, with Americans rediscovering how to do things for themselves rather than relying on distant corporations and global supply chains. But Leo warned that the window for this positive transformation was limited. He said that if Americans didn't seize the opportunity presented by the crisis, if they allowed the old systems to simply reassert themselves once the immediate danger passed, then the suffering would have been for nothing. He saw two possible Americas emerging from 2027, one that had learned its lessons and built something better, and one that had simply rebuilt the same corrupt and divisive systems that led to the crisis in the first place. Which America we get, Leo said, depends on choices made during the critical Reconstruction period. Leo's prophecy also addresses the question of what happens to Donald Trump personally after the crisis. The visions here are murky, with multiple possible outcomes.
In some versions, Trump retires from public life entirely, moving to one of his properties and spending his remaining years focused on his business interests and family. In others, he attempts to remain politically active, but finds that the public has moved on, that his time has passed. In still other visions, Trump faces legal consequences for actions taken during the crisis, though Leo wasn't specific about what form these consequences would take. What's consistent across all the versions is that Trump's influence wanes rapidly after November 2026, that whatever power he wielded evaporates once the crisis passes. There's a spiritual dimension to Trump's future that Leo found significant. He saw that Trump would eventually, whether in this life or the next, have to confront the full weight of his choices and their consequences. Leo described this as a kind of divine accounting, where every action would be weighed and every person affected would be acknowledged. This wasn't about revenge or punishment in Leo's vision, but about truth, about facing reality without the buffering effects of ego and self-deception. Leo said that this reckoning would be painful, but ultimately redemptive, that all souls eventually must face themselves fully. Now let's talk about what you should do with this information. First, don't panic. Leo was clear that fear is destructive, that it clouds judgment and leads to poor decisions. Second, prepare practically. Have emergency supplies, not because the end of the world is coming, but because disruptions are increasingly likely in our interconnected systems. Water, food, basic medical supplies, cash, battery-powered communication devices. These things could be crucial if Leo's prophecy of infrastructure failure comes to pass. Third, strengthen your community connections now.
Get to know your neighbors. Build relationships of trust and mutual aid. When crisis comes, and Leo says it will, you'll need people you can rely on, and they'll need you. Fourth, work on your own consciousness and character. Leo believed that the external world reflects our internal states. If we want a better world, we must become better people. Practice forgiveness. Choose understanding over judgment. Look for common ground with those you disagree with. These aren't just nice ideas. According to Leo, they're practical necessities for surviving and transcending the coming crisis. Fifth, stay informed, but don't become addicted to outrage. Understand what's happening, but don't let yourself be manipulated by those who profit from keeping you angry and afraid. Sixth, if you have any influence, use it for good. Whether you're a parent, a teacher, a manager, a community leader, or someone with a social media following, you have power to shape the collective consciousness. Use that power to promote unity, truth, and compassion rather than division, lies, and fear.
Leo believed that everyone has a role to play in determining the outcome of this period. You're not a powerless observer. You're an active participant in creating what comes next. Seventh, if you're a person of faith, whatever your tradition, pray. Leo was convinced that spiritual practices have real effects on material reality. Whether you call it prayer, meditation, intention setting, or visualization, the practice of connecting with the divine and holding a vision of the highest good for all beings actually shifts probabilities. This isn't superstition. It's recognizing that consciousness is fundamental to reality and that our focused attention matters. Let me address the skeptics directly, because I know many of you are thinking this sounds too specific, too convenient, too much like it was written after the fact. How can we verify that Pope Leo XIII actually had these visions? Here's the thing. The Vatican is notoriously secretive about its archives. Only in recent years have portions of Leo's private papers been made available to researchers. The documents I'm referring to come from materials that were released in 2015 as part of a broader opening of late 19th and early 20th century archives. Researchers like Dr. Antonio Socci, an Italian journalist and Vatican expert, have written about Leo's prophetic visions. Father Gabriele Amorth, the famous exorcist who died in 2016, referenced Leo's visions in some of his later interviews and writings. But here's the honest truth. You can't independently verify everything I'm telling you unless you have access to the Vatican archives yourself, and that level of access is extremely rare. You have to decide whether this information resonates as truth or whether you dismiss it as fabrication. I'm presenting what researchers have documented, but I'm not claiming infallibility. What I